This is Part 10, Chapter 10 of What If the Kamado Siblings Parted Ways. Link in description. If you enjoy this What If fanfic, then like, comment, and subscribe for more. Chapter Start. Branching Paths by Skyward Strike. Chapter 10, Clashing Iron. Tanjiro grunted as his back hit the tiles, with him landing roughly after being knocked back, but managing to roll to his feet and skid all the way to the edge of the rooftop he was in. No time to waste, he's coming, he exclaimed in thought, raising his blade as his opponent landed on the opposite side of the roof and made a straight dash for him. Taking another deep breath, the demon slayer would rush in to meet him, and aim for a decapitating swing, only for the demon to move under his blade, while bumping slightly onto his leg, which at their speed was enough to cause Tanjiro to lose balance and be sent flying. The demon would quickly come to a sudden stop before rushing back at the swordsman while he was still midair, but would be forced to back off the attack when Tanjiro planted a palm on the ground mid-fall, and while upside down, swung his blade upwards to narrowly miss his foe. He flipped himself back to his feet, but even then was given no time to rest as he sidestepped the demon's dash and jumped away at another one of his attacks, landing on the other side of the roof, only for his foe to follow after him and throw in a punch that Tanjiro only managed to catch on his katana's hilt in between his hands, but nonetheless felt his whole body shake from its impact and was thrown all the way across the road, roughly landing back first on yet another rooftop. "What's wrong?" Kamado asked with a grin, his right eye with the lower moon 6 kanji glinting in the moonlight as he stared down his opponent. "Don't tell me you're hurting already. You promised me a surprise, didn't you? So far it's pretty underwhelming. Don't get too smug yet." Tanjiro groaned as he rose from the hole created on the side of the roof from his landing. "We're barely getting started here." Kamado chuckled at his response, before jumping across the road himself, and landing on the other side of the rooftop from Tanjiro. "You really just don't get it. There is an order to things. Boy," he explained, slowly walking towards the demon slayer, who in turn raised his blade defensively. "Long ago humans were the top species on this planet. No other creature could rival them. But then the progenitor of all demons was born, and started to create more and more of his kind in this world. We overtook you in the food chain and would have taken the world by now if not limited by numbers. In time though, people discovered ways to slay demons. Sunlight and special blades. And thus you were created. Demon slayers, people who could rise to challenge demons and actually kill them. The progenitor was dissatisfied by this, as even though these humans posed no more threat to him than an ant would, they still were undoing his precious work. And thus he gave his power to 12 demons, and the demon moons were born, the elite made with the focus of dealing with the threat of the demon slayers. But even then, you persisted. The greatest warriors of the demon slayers, the pillars, were created to deal with their threat, and when they eventually discovered breathing techniques, they found themselves able to rival the weaker ones of us, and thus the progenitor separated us again between those who were killed by pillars, the lower moon, and those who had enough power to kill pillars themselves, the upper moons." At this point, Kamado was just some 10 feet away from Tanjiro when he stopped walking. But the demon slayer could only raise an eyebrow at this whole spiel. "Just get to the point already." The lower moon's grin seemed to widen. "It's quite simple, really. There's an order to things, you see. Demons kill humans, demon slayers kill demons, lower moons kill demon slayers, pillars kill lower moons, upper moons kill pillar, and the progenitor stands above them all unmatched. There are many demons and demon slayers stronger than me. But you," he pointed at Tanjiro, "are no pillar. In the end, you'll just die by my hand like all the others. It's just the way of things." Tanjiro narrowed his eyes for a moment, as his lips twisted into a scowl. "Just the way of things, you say? Killing people is just the way of things." He turned his glare at the demon intensely. "I don't believe in something as stupid as that. Upper moons. Lower moons. Pillars, they're just fancy titles you all like to throw around. The only thing that matters now is if you can or can't kill me before this blade reaches your neck, and I'm willing to bet my life on the latter. Kamado looked at him smugly then, unfazed by the demon slayer's glare. My neck, huh? Well, we'll see about that, he said before finally moving in again, running slightly diagonally across the rooftop so he had a higher ground than Tanjiro when he slashed, which allowed the demon to dodge while flipping over the swordsman, swinging his palm in a chopping strike aimed at the back of the boy's neck in an attempt to sever his spine in one clean hit. Tanjiro, however, caught that coming from the corner of his eye and lowered his head in time so only the demon's clawed nails would graze onto his neck, and used the momentum of his missed swing to spin around and slash at the demon just as he landed, forcing Kamado to twist back his body to dodge. While backing up from the quick subsequent swings that followed, pushed back ever closer to the roof's back. Seeing that though, Tanjiro would try and capitalize on it, feinting a swing at his foe only to instead switch his stance at the last moment and throw a kick that would knock him over the edge and down onto the streets. At least, that's what was supposed to happen. He didn't expect that Kamado would fall for the feint, and yet still manage to raise his hand and catch his kick. He also didn't expect for the lower moon to then grin at him, before grabbing onto his leg with the other hand as well and swinging Tanjiro over his shoulder before tossing him over the rooftop's edge and down to the street. Luckily, he'd land head first onto the ground, which meant his tough skull absorbed most of the impact, and turning his desperate tumbling across the ground into a half-decent roll that allowed him to get back to his feet only somewhat dizzy. Once again, lucky him, since he'd immediately have to dodge Kamado, who jumped right after him and was already bringing his fist down on the boy's face to do what the fall couldn't before Tanjiro narrowly jumped out of the way. The lower moon's fist instead would impact the ground, creating a considerably sized crater upon impact. Damn, he grunted, dragging his fist out of the hole it had created. That's a miss. Damn. If this fight keeps going like this, he's gonna end up getting me sooner or later, Tanjiro thought while keeping his blade raised as Kamado calmly walked towards him. He still hasn't used his blood art though, which must mean he still underestimates me. My best chance here is to catch him off guard with a breath of the sun technique. If I can get a good enough chance, I might be able to end this fight before he even gets serious. Soon enough, Kamado would begin approaching him, only at which point he suddenly rushed in at Tanjiro, aiming to blitz him in one swift motion. He'd duck when the demon slayer swung for his neck, and moved in stretching his hand out towards the boy's face, only to have said hand knocked aside with the hilt of his katana, allowing the swordsman to move to the side and make another failed attempt at a decapitation that the lower moon also dodged. He'd get a couple more fruitless swings in before Kamado spotted an opening in his guard and swung for an overhead kick forcing him to back away. Following up on that, he threw two follow-up punches that Tanjiro quickly dodged before forcing Kamado back with a swing of his own that pushed his foe away and just out of his blade's reach. Looking down at the dusty road then, the demon would suddenly smirk, before throwing a short kick at the ground beneath him, kicking up a considerably sized dust cloud towards Tanjiro in an effort to blind the demon slayer momentarily. The boy would raise his arm to protect his squinting eyes from the dust, but otherwise wouldn't move until his nose caught onto the demon's scent again and he quickly dodged beneath an overhead blow from behind. A smart tactic, but there was no way the demon could have known about his nose. Regardless, Kamado would press forward, aiming straight at Tanjiro just as he started falling back and turning to face his foe, which in turn forced him to give into his momentum and start falling towards the ground in order to evade the punch. This, however, finally seemed to give him the opening he'd been waiting for, as one of the swordsman's hands were planted against the ground behind him in order to push him back up to his feet while his other was used in lashing out with his katana at Kamado's extended arm, allowing him to finally take more than just a finger from his opponent and land his first meaningful blow in what had so far been an evading game for the two parties, switching between who was on the offensive and defensive constantly. Kamado was left startled, backing away from the demon slayer while staring at the stump of his missing arm. But had no time to do so as Tanjiro had by then pushed himself back to his feet and moved in at him. He would strike at the demon slayer with his remaining arm, trying to capitalize on his speed, but this time was caught in Tanjiro's feint when his blade only cut through air, allowing the boy to position himself just out of his foe's own reach, spinning his body while taking a proper hold of his katana's hilt. "Breath of the sun," he said, taking a deep breath. Second dance, Crimson Horizon. His blade burst in bright red flames, as they spun with him while he positioned himself beside the surprised Kamado, who was hit with the full impact of the flaming blade to the back of his neck. Except, it didn't cut. It was stopped as if it had hit a solid wall. Tanjiro would glance over his shoulder and suddenly widened his eyes at what he saw. His katana had indeed made contact with his opponent's neck, but in the spot it had impacted, it had been met with neither skin nor muscle. Rather, what had replaced it was a black metallic surface that had spread to over half of the demon's neck all the way to nearly half his face, enveloping his eye but stopping at his nose. Though the blade had managed to make some damage, it was superficial, cutting only inches into the metal, but managing to draw some blood through it regardless. "What's wrong, Demon Slayer?" the lower moon asked him as he glanced at the shocked Tanjiro from over his shoulder. "Are you surprised?" He was then forced to dodge as Kamado closed in and swung his arm at him, and he'd get a brief glimpse of the demon's fist. Its skin replaced by the same metallic material as it had done so in his neck. He was only grazed in his arm by the blow, but was sent skidding back a good distance regardless, and left with his arm throbbing in pain from blocking the blow. "He's not as fast, but to compensate his hits got way harder," Tanjiro thought, a bead of sweat running down his forehead. "So this is it, his demon blood art. So, the breath of the sun, huh? That's a new one even for me. You're really something else. I apologize for underestimating your valor as a warrior earlier, you deserve as much," the lower moon admitted, raising his maimed arm of flesh as it regenerated. "For one, it's been several years since someone else ever managed to cut off an arm of mine, and you're the fifth swordsman to cut this deep into my flesh with my black iron activated. But I think you've seen by now the reason no demon slayers ever managed to beat me," he said before he motioned with both hands to his neck. "Just as the skin around it was completely replaced by the black iron, this neck of mine is uncuttable to a blade as dull as yours." "We'll see about that," Tanjiro said quietly, even though he knew full well this new development was very bad news. He had previously bet on enclosing distance and cutting through him with a breath of the sun technique, but if even that couldn't do the job, what else was he even supposed to do? He could tell already that the blow on Kamado hadn't been easy on his katana, its white blade now somewhat dulled out and with less of an edge near its tip. He couldn't risk just throwing out more of these reckless swings and end up getting disarmed in the process. "Indeed we will." The demon chuckled menacingly as the metal covering his neck seemed to flow down his body like a liquid before fully surrounding the full length of both his arms. "Now, ready or not? Here I come." Kamado then disappeared in a burst of speed, and Tanjiro was forced to fall back just before a metallic black fist flew by only inches past his face. He himself hasn't gotten any slower, Tanjiro noted as he was forced to dodge another 2 consecutive swings of his foe, but at least his arms have. Even then, he's hitting twice as hard now that he's using this dark iron, but still, I have to make every advantage I got now count. With that motive in mind, through his dodging, he would begin guiding Kamado towards one of the nearby houses, and once they were close enough and the demon threw in his punch, he would dodge and instead let the blow sink into the wall behind, creating several cracks spreading from where the hit impacted it, but momentarily trapping the metallic fist in a hole of its own creation as planned. Tanjiro would use this chance to aim for the demon's neck again but have it stopped by the demon's other metallic arm before he was kicked back and sent sprawling down the street. It wasn't a clean hit, nor was it coated in dark iron, and it was even thrown from an awkward position, yet it hurt all the same. He'd look up though and be surprised to see that rather than pulling his hand out of the wall, the grinning Kamado was instead running at him, still dragging his metallic fist through the building before pulling back slightly and making it so only his fingers were cutting through the walls. And with surprising ease too. He'd realize the why of that soon enough, once the demon dragged his fingers out through the wall and swung at him, forcing the swordsman to duck under his attack. He would press further, forcing Tanjiro to dodge thrice over before he finally had no choice but to raise his blade and block the incoming blow. Even though the impact behind Kamado's swing did knock his blade aside despite him steadying himself for it. As he did though, his movement would slow down enough so Tanjiro would notice that the fingers in his opponent's metallic hand had somehow reshaped into thinner appendages, each with a sharp edge of their own and a sharp tip to boot. Those aren't just claws. He created blades from his fingers. He silently noted, so that means his power isn't only using his iron to coat body parts, but also reshaping those parts to better utilize it. This just creates another slew of problems. Tanjiro though could only identify as much before Kamado moved in again for a swing while his guard was down, which he, in turn, moved to dodge. Turns out though this time his opponent had feinted him, and instead moved with the momentum of his swing to elbow the demon slayer right in the gut, knocking him once again down the road. Tanjiro grunted as he looked up at the night sky from his downed position, panting and in pain. He turned around and tried to rise only for his strength to leave him as he coughed out blood in the ground before collapsing again. That can't be good. You're really something else, Demon Slayer. Even in that desperate position, you still managed to toughen your muscles and jump back to move with the blow's momentum. Kamado commended him while striding over to his opponent as he so liked doing. Hadn't you done so? More than a few of those frail's vital organs you humans so desperately need would have been turned to mush by that blow alone. As he walked through, Tanjiro would glare up, and the demon moon would cease his stride just as the very tip of Tanjiro's blade scratched his cheek when he stepped within the boy's reach. Oh. Still got some fight in you, I see. He noted with a grin, watching the rising Tanjiro struggle to get on his feet, staring daggers at his demonic opponent while heavily panting. I'm glad. Truly. The demon then admitted, raising both hands as his bladed fingers grew slightly in length. You really are the kind that deserves to be torn down properly. Breathing deeply, Tanjiro would regain his composure and take his stance as he waited for his opponent to make the first move. Kamado though gave him plenty of time to gather his bearings while he waited, and even once he was done, he still didn't move. In fact, it wasn't until Tanjiro blinked that he did. One moment he was standing just out of his reach with those bladed fingers of his, and a blink later, the demon had moved in and was its bladed hand at his face. The swordsman would raise his blade to deflect the swing while backing up to avoid having his eyes and nose torn out with that one swing, but was immediately pressed further as Kamado reversed his hand and swung again for his foe's throat, who in turn dodged again. Despite the earlier blow still taking its toll on him, Tanjiro would continue on the defensive, and as he did, something about his opponent's fighting style began becoming clear to him. With endowing his arms with dark iron, he'd sacrificed speed and agility for strength and endurance, but it wasn't just that. While before he was attacking at each and every way, now Kamado had a bias towards attacking with his arms, and even more specifically with his claws. The few times he'd switched that up since had caught the swordsman by surprise, but he'd been stupid then. The fact that Kamado's every attack was now coming in the form of a clawed swing with the odd exception was not to his advantage, but to Tanjiro's. This realization seemed to switch the flow of battle. Though the human continued to defend and the demon continued to attack, anyone watching would be able to notice the instant shift from when Tanjiro's attempts to evade his foe's attacks went from a bid for survival to a more methodical and calculated process. Kamado also noticed that, however, and began growing fiercer with his attacks. And yet every time they missed when his target moved out of the way or deflected from hitting him by the demon slayer's blade. growing quickly impatient with his lack of success and how calmly his opponent was evading his advances. The demon slashed with both his clawed hands at the swordsman to force him to back up and giving him the chance to step forward and throw a roundhouse kick that was sure to at least break a few bones. Unlike the last two times Kamado had switched from his claws to catch the human off guard though, it didn't quite work. Instead, Tanjiro would twist his body to avoid it before moving in at his foe and, despite not having a clear aim at his neck due to the metallic arms raised to protect it, he instead chose to settle with a deep gash cut along the side of his midsection, slashing through and staining the demon's white houri with a bloody red spot before he moved away to avoid another swipe of the bladed fingers. My favorite houri. First you chop off its sleeve, now you make me bleed in it. Kamado turned to him in genuine annoyance, seeming more displeased than impressed with his opponent for the first time in the fight. Is that really how you repay my courtesy, Demon Slayer? No. Once I swing to repay you, I'll make sure to aim for the neck. I'd love to see how courteous you are as a pile of ash. The Demon Slayer shot back. Hearing that, Kamado would say nothing, instead only silently smirking, and even that was different from before, less smug and confident. And more like he was picturing a gruesome death for the human standing before him. Even though it had already healed by then, the last cut he'd taken had definitely changed the outlook he had on his opponent. Instead of speaking, he only moved, jumping in at Tanjiro while spinning sideways before bringing down his bladed hand on the swordsman to try and catch him unprepared. When he swung his katana to try and deflect it however, Kamado would drag it down by holding the blade in between his sharpened fingers to open up the human's guard. As he did so, he closed his other hand's fingers into a fist with the exception of his middle one, which sprouted out as a single blade to form a blade about the size of a large knife. Upon getting the opening he'd been waiting for, he'd thrust his finger at Tanjiro to try and stab him, but he narrowly moved to the side in order to avoid this. Kamado followed closely though, and tried to stab him a few other times with his finger blade. But the swordsman would manage to pull his blade free of the demon's grasp and deflect those stabs while backing off. The demon would grin then, before clenching both hands into fists and throwing two jabs that Tanjiro dodged in quick succession, but finished with a straight too quick for the swordsman to fully escape, forcing him to block the blow on the blunt side of his katana and leading him to skid away with the impact. That was when he noticed that his back was directly against the outer walls of a house, and it dawned on him that what Kamado was trying in fact was to trap him. This realization though came a moment too late as the demon was already moving in at him, aggressively thrusting his hand and all five of its bladed fingers right at the boy's face in an attempt to mangle it. Given the situation, the only thing Tanjiro would manage to do was raise his blade vertically to intercept the demon's metallic hand, intercepting the outstretched hand with his blade right in the space between his middle and index fingers. The blow would come with enough force to push him off his feet and smash him back first into the wall behind, creating a small crater where he impacted. Regardless though, he held his katana steady while the demon's hand pushed against its trembling blade while his other arm shifted entirely, eliminating his hand in favor of a single sharp spike of dark iron emerging from his arm which, judging from his grin, he was very keen on impaling the demon slayer with. Tanjiro though pulled down his blade, slowly and steady, as the further it was from the hilt, the harder it was to keep back the demon's bladed hand, its finger blades seeming to slowly stretch out as they began approaching his eyes. That was when he chose to move however, hitting the ground and taking his blade with it. Kamado's bladed fingers thrust forward to sink into the wall behind him. His other speared hand was thrust at the human then, but Tanjiro struck the wall behind him with his elbow, giving him enough momentum to avoid the lower moon's spear by sliding right through his legs, while having his blade slash a deep gash across his left calf. The gash would cause Kamado to lose balance, only preventing himself from falling by using the wall where he'd been pinning his foe against to hold up his weight. but had only a moment to readjust himself before Tanjiro already rushed him from behind. He'd move with his blade as if preparing to swing it, and the demon would swing out his arm to try and intercept it. But he would shift his stance at the last moment as he ducked beneath the demon moon's arm and glare up at his neck while pulling back his katana, gripping it with both hands as he breathed in. Breath of the Sun, Seventh Dance. Tanjiro announced as, from the collar to its tip, his blade was again encased in the breath of the sun's flames. Before being thrust straight upwards at the demon's throat, piercing sunlight. Kamado cursed quietly but raised his chin before his entire neck was also surrounded by dark steel, creating another thin edge sprouting out in between his chin and neck so that when the flaming blade impacted it, it would be deflected to the side and hit only the wall behind its target, sinking in almost halfway through before coming to a stop. Then it was Tanjiro's turn to curse as he tried dragging his katana out of the wall and backing away, only to be hit across the head with his opponent's spear-tipped arm and once again sent flying across the road. Luckily, his reinforced head could crush even firewood under its mighty forehead, so that was the least troublesome place for him to be hit. That said, he'd rise back up fairly quickly, though somewhat dizzy, and see Kamado moving towards him. The confident grin on his face was long gone, now replaced by a deep scowl as his eyes glared irritatedly at the demon slayer. Slowly but intently, he began taking off his haori as both his arms and hands returned to a normal shape, and yet the dark iron surrounding them as well as his neck began spreading further. It seems I wasn't done underestimating you after all. Tell me your name, Demon Slayer. This is something I wish to remember. The swordsman narrowed his eyes, still holding his katana raised, but hesitantly responded, Tanjiro. My name is Tanjiro Kamado. Tanjiro Kamado. I can count in my hands the number of foes whom I had to use the full extent of my demon blood arts to put down. I will fight you as I would the strongest of the Kinoi rank. Kamado warned his foe as he finished undressing from his haori. Every inch of visible skin now covered by the same dark iron that previously only enveloped his arms and his neck. It even extended to his hair, turning his already dark brown hair a metallic black and the tips a darker shade of orange with the same metallic shine on him. The only parts that didn't seem to have been covered by the dark iron as far as Tanjiro could tell were his teeth and eyes. Blood demon art, dark iron armor. Playtime is over now, boy. Prepare to fight for your life. Thanks, but I'd much rather fight for your head instead, he replied calmly, watching his foe closely for how he'd move next. And move he did, rushing him immediately after his snide remark, and swung with a straight hook at his face. It was a straightforward attack, one he'd easily back away from. It was evident from his first step that this technique of his had taken a toll on the demon's speed, and yet, he moved with nothing else in mind but the intention to kill. From the very first blow he dodged, Tanjiro knew his hardened head that it wouldn't matter if he got hit with one of those. His neck would snap the moment the punch landed. The demon threw in a few jabs and Tanjiro could do little but dodge, though he managed to swing his katana and deflect a blow when the demon followed up with a straight. How am I supposed to fight this guy now? He wondered, even as his foe reshaped his left hand's fingers back into blades and tried swinging for his face. He'd attempt to raise his blade in defense only to have it knocked back down by Kamado's other arm, and only narrowly managed to dodge his sharpened fingers. Losing a few strands of hair in the process, I can't stay on the defensive forever. Even if he's slower, he'll get a lucky shot and eventually. But if my breath of the sun techniques aren't enough to pierce that iron skin of his, then what am I supposed to? His line of thought was cut short when he moved to evade his foe's follow-up attack, only to catch sight of something he hadn't noticed before and widened his eyes in surprise. Lining the side of the demon's dark iron-coated neck was a single white line. A sizable scratch etched into the iron by Tanjiro's own katana when he'd used piercing sunlight to try and stab him in the neck. Even with his neck returning to its normal shape right after, it had kept the mark left by his blade intact on the dark iron. In theory, that was something the demon's healing prowess should have long handled, and yet there it was. This only left him with one possible conclusion that would change the flow of battle, and this was that for as strong as his opponent's defenses might be, he was unable to heal properly if his iron-clad skin was damaged. The only reason he hadn't noticed this when his first blow had landed was that Kamado had deactivated his ability and allowed it to heal, but now that he was using it in his entire body. Reinvigorated by what that discovery meant, Tanjiro smirked as he leaned back to dodge another slash from Kamado's bladed fingers while backing up. He'd use his superior speed to dodge the blows that followed and open up some space while leading the demon after him. At which point he would strike at the ground with his blade and use his opponent's own earlier trick to create a cloud of dust to blind him. Kamado would raise his arm to cover his eyes from the dust and would start moving in back towards the demon slayer, only for a shadow to emerge from the smoke beside him. One which was quickly sliced up with a swing of his arm. Rather than cutting through flesh and bone, however, what his fingers connected with was nothing but fabric as he sliced through his own previously discarded Haori right before Tanjiro emerged from amidst the cloud of dust behind him and moved in to try and stab his foe in the one spot where he seemed to be vulnerable, his eyes. Rather than being blinded though, the demon moon grunted and managed to move his head to the side so the blow would only graze along its temple rather than making contact. And immediately retaliated by swinging his leg to catch the swordsman with a kick to his side, only rather than have it just land. Tanjiro would jump in and slam both feet on the side of the demon's metallic leg, using the power behind the kick to trampoline himself skyward, well above the buildings around them. He'd barely be allowed the chance to land, however, as Kamado suddenly glared up in anger before crouching slightly and leaping right after him. Bursting through wall and roof alike before taking another impulse to leap right after the falling Tanjiro in order to intercept him midair. Immediately upon reaching his target, he'd grab onto the end of the swordsman's Haori and try to pull him in while throwing in a punch. Only for the human to react by slashing off the end of his Haori grabbed onto by his foe and weave to evade his punch. He'd slash at Kamado to try and push him away, only for the demon to block the blow with one arm and kick at Tanjiro. Though he would manage to block the brunt of the blow with the guard of his sword, that didn't solve the fact that he was sent flying back down to the rooftop below at crazy speeds. He'd managed to use the slope in it to roll on landing though, breaking his fall somewhat, before leaping over to the next rooftop across the road. He wasn't a moment too late as, soon after, Kamado himself would land in the first rooftop, collapsing it entirely under the weight of his dark iron-clad body. Tanjiro would grunt while rising to his feet, looking at the half-collapsed house across the street, before Kamado leapt out of the remains and gripped onto the edge of the roof his foe stood in. Climbing up with ease while glaring at the human, shit, if I had managed to blind even one of his eyes. That would have given me the chance to throw in a proper attack without the risk of getting hit, but now that he knows I'm targeting that, he won't give me another shot so easily. He noted, trying to rein in his frustration. Dwelling on what he could have done better wouldn't help him figure out how to beat the demon after all. Come on, think. You know, this is really starting to lose its fun. The demon noted, interrupting his line of thought and causing him to look up across the roof to his foe. I guess it was expected after I activated my dark iron armor, but now all you can do is block, dodge, run away. You barely attack anymore. He then opened up a wide cruel smirk. I know what's gonna make this fun again though. All I have to do is to start killing every other human in this town. Maybe if I get you mad enough, you'll finally be able to swing that sword hard enough to start cutting into my neck. This statement caused Tanjiro to widen his eyes, his hands gripping tighter onto his trembling katana as a vein popped along his temples. His teeth sinking into his lower lip for a moment in an attempt to contain his bout of anger. And yet, it all only made the demon grin wider as he saw his words hitting the sore spot just as intended. I hate it. I hate how you demons say these things so lightly. He said, quietly but intensely, do you have no pity for the people you slaughter? You were human too once. How can you feel no regret? Do I have to repeat myself, boy? It is the food chain. Demons eat humans. Nature willed it so. Kamado coldly stated, in my eyes, your kind is no more than talking cattle. The only difference is that some like you have a bit more fight in them. That was the straw that broke the camel's back, as the last strained strand of Tanjiro's composure snapped, and he glared up hatefully at the demon. There is nothing natural about this all. Every species on this planet strives to create something, however small, to leave behind to their offspring's brighter future. But demons, you just kill and destroy, caring about nothing but yourselves. If you really think of us as nothing more than cattle, then that just means you forgot why humans shouldn't be underestimated. The demon slayer told him, before taking in a deep breath. I don't care how tough you are anymore. I'm gonna cut that hardened neck of yours and break your precious food chain once and for all. Breath of the sun, first dance, waltz. The katana in his hands burst once again with powerful flames encasing its edge as it was raised defiantly at the demon moon standing across it. Whose smirk hadn't even faltered after his opponent's speech. Instead, he only raised both his darkened arms, getting into a fighting stance himself. Very well, swing as hard you like then, human. With that said, he moved in at Tanjiro, and swung at him. Only to be met in his dash and have his blow blocked when met by a swing of the flaming blade. His fingers grew sharpened once again as he threw two more blows. And yet they were likewise deflected by the demon slayer before he swung for the demon's neck and cut an inch or two deep gash across his throat. Though this prevented him from dodging fully when the demon moon swung to retaliate and had to block with his katana. Being thrown back by the blow and landing on yet another roof while his foe quickly pursued him. Tanjiro would raise his blade, only for his foe to suddenly stop and use his momentum to kick up a couple of the tiles in the roof directly towards him. Though he ducked to dodge those, Kamado would take this chance to close in and swing for his face, and he would very nearly have his nose torn off if not for a quick leap back. The swordsman would continue backing up as the demon pursued him, swinging his blade one-handed to deflect his swings and punches. Before finally managing to get the chance to dodge by leaping over him, all the while spinning midair and swinging to land a slash on the side of the lower moon's head, cutting a line across his ear. Upon landing, things would switch up as he moved in immediately for his opponent and began pressuring him with a series of quick, flame-covered swings that forced him to block with his metallic arms, leaving a few more significant scratches on the surface of his dark iron skin. The pressure of his offensive would eventually lead them to yet another rooftop, where Tanjiro continued his slashing, with the demon still blocking until he found a good chance to dodge and tried to go for the offensive against his attacker. He, however, would duck under Kamado's blow and move behind him while swinging as if aiming for the demon's neck. His foe raised his other arm to block him, but his defense was somewhat sloppy, and though he wouldn't get a clean shot to the neck, Tanjiro still shifted his blow enough so that instead of being stopped by the demon's forearm, it would be aimed slightly upwards, to instead slash off both his left index and middle fingers. His flaming blade barely slowed down by the dark iron coating them. That, he hoped, was what would give him the real opening for the demon's neck, which he quickly followed up with a horizontal slash of his flaming blade. But he underestimated the lower moon and was stopped by the same arm he'd deprived off 2 fingers moments ago. With Kamado already spinning around to throw an upward swing of his other arms at Tanjiro, the demon slayer would disengage and opt to back up, but widen his eyes when swing reached past what he thought to be his foe's range and landed a deep cut stretching from his chin to the corner of his lower lip, causing his head to jerk upwards and for him to stumble upon his landing, the flames on his blade fading out as he raised his hand to cover the newly opened gash in his face while turning to stare at what exactly had cut him. Much to his surprise, rather than the normal finger-turned knives that Kamado had been using before, this time his entire forearm had shifted into a single-edged blade of about the same size of his normal arm, but somewhat lengthier, explaining the unexpected boost in his reach. What? Thought I hadn't any tricks left up my sleeve, Tanjiro Kamado. He asked with that same smug grin that had begun so quickly irritating the boy in the short time he'd known the demon. Well, quite clearly you were wrong. Tanjiro grunted as he felt blood rushing past his chin and down his neck, even in spite of him covering the wound with his hand. It was clear now, he'd made a terrible mistake going in as he did, allowing himself to get riled up by words and giving the demon the straightforward brawl where his foe knew he could triumph in. He probably also didn't expect how hard the demon slayer's own offense would be, but it really didn't matter. Every blow landed on the demon was an attempt to wear him down and get an opening, but every blow thrown at Tanjiro was done with the clear intention to kill, and this last one, in particular, had nearly split his face apart. And to make matters worse, he was also feeling the drawback of his breath of the sun weighing on him, his body overheating as his muscles ached and his lungs burned. Yet, in spite of it all, his sword was still held, silently raised before him. Seeing the fight in the human's eyes though, Kamado chuckled, "You just don't give up, do you? I gotta admire that." However, he raised his foot then, before stomping down hard, causing cracks to spread around from the spot where his foot hit the floor before the entire half of the rooftop suddenly collapsed beneath their feet. Tanjiro found himself then on the second floor of a house amidst a cloud of dust and several broken-off tiles. The walls facing the streets and the neighboring house both collapsed around them as well, while the demon leapt down from the roof, landing in the rubble as his other arm too shifted into a blade of its own. Don't think your death will be less painful because of it. He moved in quickly as Tanjiro rose from the pile of tiles and rubble he found himself on before having to block his opponent's swings with his own katana, taking a two-handed grip on its hilt uncaring for the blood gushing from the wound in his chin. His blows seemed faster now and without a doubt far more deadly, forcing him to back away while knocking aside Kamado's blades with his own. That lasted until he'd found himself backed up against an edge, and the demon would lock both his blades crossed together against his own before suddenly swinging with them both while pushing the demon slayer back, sending him flying through the walls of a neighboring building and into someone's empty living room. The demon moon leapt in after his target as the groaning boy was immediately forced to roll back as to not have his legs relieved by his opponent's bladed arm. He rose groggily but continued backing up while frantically defending himself against Kamado's non-stop slashing, backing up until he'd feel his lower back hit something. And with a glance over his shoulder, he'd realize it was a table, and suddenly flip over it as his foe brought down his bladed arm to cut right through it. Rolling to land on the other side, Tanjiro would rise back to his feet and kick the table up towards the demon, only to have him rip apart the wooden piece of furniture with his bladed arms. The swordsman though would invest on this tactic, and use the environment against his foe, by kicking up a tableside chair towards the demon, which he likewise swung his arm to tear apart. But didn't expect that Tanjiro would have used the brief second in which the chair had covered his line of sight to close in distance, starting to push against his limits as he breathed in deeply. Breath of the sun, fourth dance. Burning sunrise. He slashed upwards with his katana bursting with fire as he avenged his own recent injury by leaving a cut from Kamado's own chin, over his lips, left eye and ending in his forehead. Angrily, the demon moon swung to rip the human apart, but he nimbly dodged, moving towards his foe's newly acquired blind spot. He leapt, planting a foot on the wall to flip over Kamado and land behind him, aiming to disorientate the demon and go for a surprise shot at his neck before he could react. He didn't expect however for the demon to swing with a kick blindly, nor for it to hit home a moment before he landed. He raised his left arm to block it as the heel of his foe's foot made contact and he'd feel the snapping sensation in his arm before being sent flying through the nearest wall and out into the streets again, landing roughly on his way down. Tanjiro groaned on the ground, breathing in heavily despite the pain. He didn't even need to look to know his left arm was broken, and being sent flying through a wall and crashing down onto the road hadn't helped much. All that was without mentioning the aggravating symptoms his fifth breath of the sun technique that day being thrown out. He felt feverish, his muscles ached, his vision blurred, and yet adrenaline and spirit pulled him back to his feet. Still holding onto his katana with a deathly grip despite now only being able to wield it effectively with one hand. You're a worthy opponent, and yet so limited by that frail body of yours. He looked up to see Kamado saying, standing at the edge of the hole on the wall created by kicking him through it. Were you a demon yourself, you would probably have killed me long ago. But instead, you stick to your humanity, as if an aging body and broken bones are something to be proud of. The demon scoffed as he allowed the dark iron to fade momentarily from coating his skin, allowing the multiple wounds he'd garnered from Tanjiro to begin healing. Normally, this would be the moment the boy had been waiting to attack. And yet the distance between them and the state he was in already meant such an attack would be impossible at the present moment. And all I had to do was bait you into thinking you could wound me, just because I can't heal through my dark iron when it's active. All the talk of not underestimating humanity. And yet there you. With all his wounds healed, the demon moon would leap down to the street, dark iron once again encasing his skin entirely, now untouched by any previous cuts or scratches. Demonkind is simply above your inferior humanity as a whole. A natural step forward. Can you not see as much now? Tanjiro looked down for a moment, blood still falling in droplets to the ground from the wound in his chin as his injured arm hung loosely to his side. You say that with such conviction. And yet, I've never needed to hide from sunlight before. He murmured, before suddenly looking up at Kamado. And surprising the demon with the fact that despite his eyes showing his tiredness, the grin on his face said otherwise, you think yourself so high and mighty as a species. But you know what you really are. You're not an improvement on humankind, you're a plague on this world. A pest that feeds off humanity, no different from a rat or a moth. This speech ironically seemed to get under the demon moon's seemingly impenetrable skin more than any of his sword strikes did as he curled his hands into fists. It was obvious the human was trying to antagonize him just as what had been done to himself earlier, but even then, Kamado was not used to being disrespected, be it by human or demon slayer. The symbol on his eye made sure of that much. Careful, boy, he said warningly, there are still ways I can punish you for insulting a demon moon. You wouldn't want to die knowing I'll massacre the rest of this town because of your disrespect, would you? Demon moon. Don't make me laugh. You're lower moon 6, the literal bare minimum, and yet you speak with all the bravado of Kibutsuji himself. He spat out, noticing the deepening look of anger in the demon's visage. Except you'd probably shit yourself if you ever came across an actual pillar according to your food chain. For someone who so enjoys spewing out how superior to humans they are, you sure fear us a lot, no? Judging from his bloodshot eyes and the infuriated look on his metallic face, this statement, in particular, seemed to hit a sore spot for the demon. So much so that he immediately moved in at the demon slayer without even bothering to respond to his taunting. With his broken arm hampering his fighting ability by quite a bit, Tanjiro did what he could do, he dodged. He weaved in between Kamado's punches, dodged his bladed fingers and, when it came to it, swung out his katana to deflect the occasional blow. It was taking all of his attention to only keep up with his enraged opponent while backing up from his ceaseless advance. Upon dodging underneath one of his sharpened swings and responding with a swing of his own to intercept the following attack, he'd jump back and catch an alleyway in between two houses at the corner of his eye. He'd look back at Kamado and see the enraged demon moon morphing both his arm into dark iron blades once again and decided to take the alleyway. As he did, he'd be quickly caught up by the demon, and be once again forced to evade his irate slashing. Completely uncaring for the narrow walls surrounding them as his blades cut through them without barely slowing down his swings. Tanjiro tried dodging in hesitation of testing his own blade against that kind of cutting power, but was eventually forced to resort to deflecting. And then blocking outright when the demon swung both blades at his foe at once, a blow that the boy could barely defend himself from in his one-handed situation. And that sent him skidding all the way past the other end of the alleyway, at which point he blinked as he was met with a bit of an unexpected sight. Just some 50 yards down the road was one of Kaigara's large piers, housing some smaller houses and businesses in it. It was also currently on fire, both a great deal of the pier itself and most of the houses in it. Tanjiro would get barely any time to question what had happened though when he had to return his attention to the dashing Kamado. The demon would continue his flurry of attacks, and the demon slayer would be forced to dodge the first few, before being once again forced into defending himself from them with his sword. Pushed back in by the non-stop influx of slashes and swings in the process. He was giving his all just in the hopes of keeping up, and this eventually came to test him when he defended a downward swing of Kamanu's blade, locking blades momentarily with the demon. At which point, he smirked and pushed back his blade close to Tanjiro's face before pulling it to the side, creating a short-lived shower of sparks with the metals clashing that went directly into the human's arm, leaving him blinded for a single moment. More than enough time for a battle to be decided in. The demon would grin widely, and swing his arm in for the kill. Despite it all happening in a moment's notice, time seemed to slow down for Tanjiro when he closed his eyes then. He was aware of what was happening, what was about to happen. He could hear the blade cutting through the air destined to take his life, and yet, he never panicked. More so, he wondered what would happen. Would he see his life flash before his eyes? Well, that was what expected. But instead, what hit him was the smell. The smell he'd smelled 1,000 times, and yet couldn't properly place. And yet, somewhere in this brain, he knew what this smell translated to, and his body moved as if from pure instinct. Lowering his head just ever so slightly down and in the process avoided having his head cut in two by the lower moon's blade. Vision slowly returning to him, Tanjiro would tighten his one-handed grip on his blade, and despite everything still being more blurry than not, he attempted to seize the moment. Swinging in with everything he got right at the demon moon's neck. And yet, everything he got with one arm wasn't enough, as his vision returned fully just to see the irritatingly smug grin on Kamanu's face as his blade-turned hand again had intercepted the katana, closing into a fist around it. "It's over," was all he said, before bringing down his other arm still. Vision returned fully just to see the irritatingly smug grin on Kamanu's face as his blade-turned hand again had intercepted the katana, closing into a fist around it. "It's over," was all he said, before bringing down his other arm still in its blade form and snapping his katana's blade down in the middle, thus breaking the weapon. Tanjiro's eyes widened for a moment in shock at seeing his katana, the one gifted to him by Satoshi in the final selection, broken like that. And that was all Kamado needed to place a palm against his chest before, only with a slight push, sending the swordsman flying and crashing right into a nearby wall and raising a cloud of dust that, once gone, revealed a bloodied Tanjiro lying amidst the rubble, still holding onto the hilt of his broken katana despite seeming completely unconscious. "Tell me now, Demon Slayer," the smirking Kamado said as he looked down upon his opponent's defeated form. "Was that not the blade you promised to decapitate me?" End chapter. If you like this fanfic, what if, then like, comment, and subscribe for more.